going to invite Chris to come up. And we've heard a little bit about you last week. For those who are here, why don't you step up to the lectern?
Thank you.
We're going to hear a little bit more about you, but...
Sorry, you don't know this. I pinched a nerve in my neck overnight, so if I preach like Frankenstein tonight, you'll know why. If I turn my whole body, that's why.
It won't make any sound.
Yeah. I woke up and thought, oh no.
All right. Last week after the service, Alex came up to me and said, let's swap out one of the songs for Desert Song, which we did.
Yeah, it was beautiful, by the way.
We sung Desert Song. We haven't sung that in a while, but we did that because of something you said last week.
Yeah.
Can you just remind us of that story?
Yeah, I mean...
And I'll get this particular lyric up.
Sure. Yeah, that song was the fulcrum of my whole story, if you like. It was when I was passed out in a psych hospital. You heard me share last week. And as I was coming to consciousness, completely a God moment, he gave me the words of that song, and in particular the bridge, all of my life in every season. You are still God, I have a reason to sing, I have a reason to worship. And it was not, I don't know, me conjuring up my own strength. I really do believe that that was given to me by God. And I said last week that I think the challenge and the comfort of that bridge is this language of in every season. When we struggle with mental illness, life, and I'll talk about this tonight, life feels and is often a roller coaster ride of ups and downs. And so this idea of having an ever-present help, an unchanging God in every season, is an incredibly powerful counter-narrative to how you might be feeling at the time.
Okay. I just want to ask you a few questions about what do we call it? Clinic, practice?
A ministry?
A ministry.
I don't know. Yes, life to the full.
At Belrose. Last
Yep.
week, did we speak last week a little bit about some of the services you offer there?
I don't know, did we?
Why don't we run through them
Sure.
again?
Yeah.
The kinds of help that Life to the Full offer.
Yeah. In many ways, it's an extension of what I've been doing with you guys for the last 2 weeks over the last 8 years, which is saying to people, and I said in the sermon last week, that I don't want to pit psychology against theology. But if we try to do psychology without theology, I think we're missing something. And that's really the umbrella premise. I've got a long history with Covenant Christian School at Belrose as a teacher and as a student. I was doing some consultancy work for them a few years ago and met a pastor of a church on the Northern Beaches, very small church of about 30 people, that had predominantly birthed Covenant back in the day in the 70s, I subsequently learned. Very small church, had just sold a ministry property, wondering what the parable of the talents looked like for them. And they committed a significant amount of money for us to start what is now Life to the Full. So it is basically, well, it's got 3 branches. It's got we do content, so we create social media content, we preach at churches, trying to integrate theology with practical everyday life, which is mental health related and other things as well. But the backbone is really the clinic at Belrose, as you say, Martin, and we've got clinical psychologists, registered psychologists, a sexologist, relationship counsellors, what am I missing? Pastoral supervisor, and I offer spiritual direction. So it's really trying to embody this holistic picture in practice for people who need that support. And it's very satisfying to be part of this now, given the best I could have hoped for previously was this is what I've learned now, best of luck to you. And you will hear me say tonight that I believe our local churches are crucial. So to be very, very clear, Life to the Full is not seeking to be instead of our local churches. It's in partnership with a level of clinical expertise that churches might not be able to handle. But by the same token, churches offer robust long-term relationships. I just actually was watching an Instagram video of a friend of mine who said the church is a sleeping giant in this mental health picture. And I believe that too, that we want to walk side by side with churches, and that's how we do it. And then the third activity that we're getting off the ground next year, which I'm very excited about, is spiritual retreats for people who want to take some time away with the Lord in a bit more of it's not quite a camp, but it's just a chance to contemplate, pray together, share stories, break bread, just in a bit more of a deeper, more intimate way.
Tell us a little bit about some of my understanding is if someone has personal things they want to work through, they can come and see Life to the Full. There's also a professional kind of aspect to it as well. Like you talk about professional supervision.
Yep.
What kind of professions might seek you out and what can you offer?
Yeah, sure. So Jamie Dixon is our professional or pastoral supervisor. He calls himself pastoral and professional supervisor. So he sees pastors who need a sounding board in their leadership, but also a lot of school leadership. The Christian schools kind of space is a key area for us. So as well as professional supervision coaching, we also offer EAP programs, employee assistance programs. So what that is, for example, YouthWorks, formerly Anglican YouthWorks, we are their EAP provider, which means that part of their ongoing support as YouthWorks employees is that they can access our team for a certain amount of sessions per year. And the same with a bunch of Christian schools that we've already signed on as well. So you don't have to have a mental health care plan. We also offer partnerships with Christian workplaces particularly.
Okay. I'm going to throw another question out there.
Sure.
Who might see a sexologist?
No one who's willing to admit it. No, it's a really good and important question because I think what Monica, our sexologist, does is very important. I'd say probably there's three main groups of people, especially in this Christian space, but not always. A young Christian engaged couple who want to learn about not just the theology of sex, but the mechanics of sex going into marriage would be one. Another would be a married couple who their sex life is floundering and they want some sort of spark. And then another would be when there's been a betrayal or a trauma and recapturing, I guess, sexual health out of that. But Monica says very often that sex is often a prism or a metaphor for the relationship in general. So you tap into all sorts of concepts of communication, power, hurt, and people think they're coming for sexology, but often it's a broader conversation about the relationship. So it's got a psychological component to it, but it's also got a physiological component to it. Monica has a Master's of Science in Sexual and Reproductive Health, and so often there's physiology as well as psychology involved in the field of sexology.
Not everyone might know that kind of help is available, or those professionals exist. It's useful to hear about it.
Yeah, the desire is really that we can cover as many bases as we can in this. So our vision statement is holistic Christian flourishing, and that's where this holistic piece comes in, that we believe that the whole world is God's, including our sex lives. And so if we can bring a Christian worldview to play into that, we believe that we will flourish as humans as best as possible.
I'm going to hand over to you now.
Sure. I better go and get my sermon.
You get your gear, and we'll hear from you.
Thanks so much again for having me, and I've probably done the first 5 minutes of my sermon already with that interview, so you'll be happy to know that. I said last week that really the question was, what if it's me struggling? And the question of tonight is, what if it's somebody who I love? Particularly somebody in the church, but not necessarily. You can apply this to anybody who you can think of in your life. Bit of a shameless plug, this talk is in many ways a combination of the two books that I've written. I alluded to Down Not Out last week, and then this year I've had the privilege of releasing a second book called Here to Love, recapturing the centrality of Jesus' greatest command. I'd always aspired to write a book. I never thought I would, but it's very, very cool to have that honour. And when people ask me, how did you get a book deal? Because it is quite competitive and difficult. The answer I often give is the name of a person by the name of Alison Mitchell. Alison is one of the senior editors of the Good Book Company in the UK. And when I pitched the manuscript idea for Down Not Out, she was very enamoured with the concept because I found out subsequently that she herself had struggled with mental illness for a long, long time and was herself a committed Christian looking for something to publish in this space. Now, when Down Not Out was published in 2017, there was an accompanying blog post that Alison herself wrote on the Good Book Company's website talking about her experience of being in the church as a committed Christian, but living with a deep depression for a long period of time. And in that article, she writes a story about an Easter Sunday service that I want to share with you. It's a relatively lengthy story, but I think it's worth the time. This is Alison's words, direct quote. "She probably thought I was very rude. She sat next to me on Easter Sunday morning, smiled and asked how I was, but I just nodded my head and looked away. She didn't try again. What she didn't know was how hard I'd battled to get to church. Now I was just barely managing to stay in my seat and not burst into tears. Every muscle was straining, desperate to flee. And yet part of me wanted to be there. I was glad to be in my own church for Easter and to join with my church family in singing the Lord's praises. This is what depression can do to a Christian. Having struggled with severe depressive illness for over 12 years, and that was about 8 years ago now, I can tell you that I never," she writes again, "never want to go to church on a Sunday morning. It's an exhausting battle every single time, and I don't always make it. Getting through the door is an achievement, but the battle isn't yet over. Where can I sit? Is there anyone safe to sit with? Do I have an exit strategy so that I can leave if needed without climbing over people or causing a distraction? Will I be able to sing, or would the words tumble out as sobs instead? Am I able to lift my head high enough to see the words on the screen, or will my depressed hunch mean my head stays resolutely down? And what if the pastor says something like, 'Do talk to the person next to you while the children are going out'? At that point, a shaft of dread strikes my heart. Even the end of the service is hard. How quickly can I leave without looking rude? Will the noise of so many people talking at once trigger a panic attack? Can I even lift my head high enough to smile at someone as I scuttle out? And if not, will they think again how rude and abrupt I am? I once described my own experience like this. My church was like a colourful ocean liner sailing full steam ahead, but I had fallen overboard and was drowning in a monochrome sea as they sailed away without me. Thankfully, not every depressive finds church as hard as this. It's not even true for me every Sunday. Sometimes I manage a brief chat at the end or to pray with someone before I go. When the depression is less severe, I can lift my head and sing with enthusiasm. I guess that's part of what makes it hard for my church family. They don't know which Alison is going to turn up. I can testify she loves the Lord. I would call her a personal friend of mine. And yet this is her complicated feelings towards church. And I say that word complicated very intentionally. That is the biggest word that I would use to summarize what she's saying here. If she doesn't know which Alison is going to turn up herself, what hope do the rest of us have if we see her in the pews? Which is why I think we need a true north as we think about this very complicated issue. What's that one thing you can take away from tonight and embed as a church community? And that one thing, as that melding of those two books might imply, I'm going to try to advocate for, is love. What should I do in response to mental illness? I should love. I think Scripture shows us that love is the greatest command. As the Pharisees are famously trying to trap Jesus, asking him if there is a greatest command, Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now that's a commandment that I was very familiar with, but in my second book, it's what Jesus says next when I first really stopped to think about it that really floored me in my tracks. He says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. All of them. It's not just the greatest commandment because it's better than all the other commandments. It's the greatest commandment because it encompasses all of the other commandments. It is our true north of the Christian life. But of course, the rub of this command is that I loved the cup of coffee I had for breakfast this morning. I love my Volkswagen Polo GTI that I drove to church in this afternoon, even though it's got flashing dashboard lights at the moment. It's freaking me out. And I love the Lord. Love is different at an engagement party as it is at a funeral. So how on earth do we understand this true north commandment to love? What does it look like in practice? And I believe we start with God's love for us. I shared some of my favorite verses of Scripture last week, that God demonstrates his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. There's the start of an answer of what love is. As we drill down, I alluded to a passage in Hebrews 4. We didn't have it in the reading, but I just want to pause on it for a second because I think it's so powerful. That because God has demonstrated his love for us, Romans 5:8, that means, according to the author of Hebrews, that we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses. I find that one of the most beautiful truths of the Christian faith, that because of the incarnation, because God himself became one of us in Jesus Christ, he looks at suffering and doesn't think, I've heard about that. Yeah, I read about that in a textbook. As if he's some far-off deity. He says, no. I know that. I know what it is to be weak. I can empathize with you in yours. And what does that mean? It means we can receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. So as we begin to apply these two words, mercy and grace, the more we begin to reflect God's love with one another. Now, I'm still speaking conceptually, and we will get concrete as we keep going. But while we're still on this concept of, if we want to understand what love is, we begin with God. One of the things I tried to show you last week was that in order to move forward with present uncertainty and sit with the mess of life, we need to look back. We need to think about all that God has already done for us. And we saw that again in Psalm 103, the reading tonight. That we praise the Lord, and as we praise him, even King David could say this in the Old Testament, not knowing he was going to be Jesus' great-grandfather. Even then, in the story of history, King David draws on this same psychological, spiritual discipline of forgetting not the Lord's benefits. I'm not going to go through that psalm word for word. We just had it read, but what I want to make crystal clear is what we see throughout that whole psalm is a God who is so spectacularly powerful, and with that power, so perfectly loving. A God who, in verse 19, in his power, his kingdom rules over all. A God who the angels and even the stars themselves would consider worthy of their allegiance. And with that power, verse 3, he forgives sins, he heals diseases, he redeems life from the pit. He satisfies desires, he works justice and righteous for the oppressed. Now, the thing that strikes me about this psalm is it's not just saying God is a God of love in his qualities. King David goes to great lengths to talk about God's love in its quantity as well. What do I mean? Verse 8. Not only does he say that God is compassionate and gracious, that's a quality, but the quantity of those things are that he is slow to anger and he is abounding in love. If you keep looking, verse 11, not only does the Lord love those who fear him just a little bit or somewhat, no, he loves them as high as the heavens are above the earth. Verse 12, not only has he removed our transgressions from us, he has removed them as far as the east is from the west. Verse 17, his love does not just last a little bit of time. It lasts from everlasting to everlasting. And one more, verse 22. Not only does the Lord work in some places, he works everywhere in his dominion. A God of unending power and infinite love. And so when we are called to love with the love of God, it is a high bar. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But this is why I'm going on and on about love and mental health. As we come into the New Testament, again, the Apostle Paul, same strategy. What do we do in view of God's mercy? Again, notice we start with God's love for us. That's why I'm doing this exercise with you. Before we apply love to one another, let's keep drilling down how much God has loved us. Let's think about what our lives would have been like had he not loved us. So in view of that mercy, what do? We offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Once again, it's a high bar, but it's the bar that God sets for us. We are the recipients of that. And I believe the more we can reflect that to one another, the more we will be that unleashed superpower in this mental health picture. I mentioned in Psalm 103 that I love it because it's the quality of love and the quantity, because the harsh fact of the matter is that if we want to love well in this mental health picture, it's not just a virtue that we want to embody, but we're probably going to need a lot of it, or more specifically, we're going to need to do it for a long time. I don't know if you've heard this, but there's a saying in secular society, and I'm thankful for it, hear me clearly, that says that just like we should see a doctor for a broken leg, we should also see a doctor for depression. And it's doing a good work in trying to destigmatize the reality and the shame of mental health. So in that way, it's a very helpful thing to say. The problem with the analogy is that without knowing, it's actually comparing what is often an acute illness, i.e. a broken leg, that you might be in a cast in for 8 weeks, with a chronic illness. Again, Alison, my editor, has been depressed at that time for 12 years, plus the other 8 since then. We're now up to 20. And so this is why I'm talking about the quality of love and the quantity of love. Because, church, we're playing a long game here. I know we asked last week in Q&A, what do we do about it? And if you remember nothing else from tonight, I'm saying to you, play the long game, please. And I'll get to why that is in a minute. In 2012, a team of scientists from Harvard University developed a new technology called magnetic resonance scanning. And they were able to scan the real neural pathways of a brain. And this is what it showed. That's a real brain. Now, believe me when I say to you that I am no scientist. That is not false Christian humility. But even I know that that is more complicated than a leg bone. The journey is seldom short, and sometimes it feels like it finds no actual tangible destination. Now, I do believe that we can get better, and I do believe in cure. But I also believe in what was taught to me as I left hospital, that what I'm about to show you is in very many ways a graphical form of what I'm trying to say to you, which is my story and the story I've seen as I've walked with others. That's a more realistic picture of what you're in for as a church community. The goal here is that upwards and to the right average over a long period of time. But within that average, you are going to have peaks and you're going to have troughs. And the problem is what happens when we go wrong is we get too fused to the highs of the peaks and too devastated with the downs of the troughs. It was taught to me to not confuse a lapse with a relapse. That is that I will have bad days in my journey, and I do. But when I have a bad day, it's very, very tempting to think I'm back at square one. But a bad day and square one are two different things. I have relapsed once in my 10-year journey, but more often than not, it is this peaks and troughs picture, and I need to zoom it out, I need to average it. Now, believe it or not, I think that these diagrams, these resonance scanning and this line graph that I've drawn have a direct link to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because in that famous chapter of love in 1 Corinthians 13, if you know it, the Apostle Paul says that love is many, many things. But he says the first one is that love is patient. It's not a straight line trajectory. And it does take more than psychology and medication. It takes community, and friendship and love. How are we to love one another in view of God's mercy? Romans 12. We can start by being joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. That would be a very good start. Straight after these verses, we see the famous encouragement to mourn with those who mourn and rejoice with those who rejoice. That is the mark of a healthy community. And I want you to remember that for those of us who are depressed or anxious, and this is my story, that not only do you feel depressed or anxious, you very often feel unlovable. You feel like you are just a drain on the community around you. What you crave most sometimes when you are the most down is unconditional love. Someone who still values you will give you the time of day when you find it near impossible to value yourself. The gospel is a balm to that crisis because it reminds us of God's great love for us, regardless of our abilities or achievements. But there's a flip side to that scenario as well. That if I feel unlovable when I'm in those troughs, and that unlovability is reinforced by those around me, then it can compound the pain. If we are communities who only love each other when it's easy, that's a painful journey. If you believe that your loved one ought to be 3 counselling sessions and 1 prescription away from wellness, and they don't get well, you either leave or you get frustrated. You have to have realistic expectations. And again, if we think about God's love, I would just gently but somewhat punchily challenge you with the fact that if God's love for you had been the same as that love for your friend, where would you be? You'd be nowhere. God would have given up at the first sign of a golden calf, but he didn't. Without God's patience, we would be lost. He is slow to anger and abounding in love. And so my question is, how can we not show patient love in the midst of one another's strife? So as we wrap up, let me give you some very, very practical steps of how we love well with this kind of patient, extravagant, God-mirroring love through a difficult, long journey with each other. The first thing to say is that you are going to need love as well as the carer. It's interesting with this book that I've just written, you often ask Christians, what's the greatest command? And they say, oh, love God and love your neighbour. They forget the as yourself bit at the end. And yes, we can drum up self-care too much in our modern age, but we have to wrestle with the fact that that as yourself is in the greatest command. Being a Christian does not mean you hate yourself. You are going to need love as well. You can't just be a giver. And can I say, as a pastor, sometimes being a giver becomes an identity. I'm the one there for other people. No one needs to be there for me. I want to say that's not true. You're as human as your loved one is. So find your own support network. When I came out of hospital, one of the first things that Lara needed to do was see a psychologist herself. I also want to say on the love part, very, very clearly, that you're not going to love perfectly. When Jesus says, love me with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your mind and all of your strength, I think he's doing 2 things. And the first thing he's doing is what I am purporting to you as a community. It's the goal of life. It is the true north of how we live. But I think he's also presenting a problem for us. The problem is, who can do that? All of my heart and all of my soul and all of my mind and all of my strength. He's setting us up for the problem that only the gospel can solve. He is the only one who did that. And so that means that when we love imperfectly, despite our best intentions, which we will, you need to remember the gospel for yourself as well. To come back to that Hebrews 4 passage. Jesus is able to empathize with our weakness because he became one of us. He was tempted in every way, but with the key difference that unlike us, he did not sin. So part of you needing love as well is you remembering the gospel as well. It is your pursuit, and you will get it wrong sometimes, and that's okay. That's part of what it is to play the long game. Please also know that there are services for carers. Lifeline is not just available for people going through stuff, it's available to support people who are supporting people going through stuff. The second thing I want to say, as well as needing love for yourself, is to find a time to listen and also a time to speak. And I say this because I think there's a bit of a swinging pendulum here. Some of us are what I might call amateur psychologists, ready to dispense diagnoses when we're not. Those people need to be remembered that you need to listen sometimes. But some of us think that actually being a Christian means I can't speak at all. And I do think we need to be slow to speak. Hear me clearly. If I have to choose between an over-listener and an over-speaker, I'd probably take an over-listener. But you can still listen and speak. We talked last week about how do I know if I'm not doing well? And one of the things I said is, have you noticed a change in yourself? And sometimes you can't. Sometimes another person sees that before you do. So if you're a loved one seeing a change in someone, you can bring it up in the right way. In fact, I would say you should. They might push it back in your face, possibly. But I still think love demands that we speak truth when we're concerned about people. And also recognize that even in the midst of a diagnosis, that person is not just their diagnosis. Alison gave me great advice once. She said, if you go out for tea with a friend before a diagnosis, keep offering to go out for tea. The conversation doesn't have to revolve around the mental illness every single time. Even when I was in hospital, I was still not just a depressed guy. There was more to me even then than that. And so find time to talk about it, to destigmatize, but also just find time to share life together. They're still a person. And then finally, and related to you needing love as well, recognize your limitations. There is great government funding. This is, I guess, the life to the full spruik, if you like, but even before life to the full, I would always say this, that if you don't know what to do yourself, or you don't know what to do for your loved one, a great first option is just to book in with a GP, go through a mental health questionnaire and see what they say. Let them do what they do well and decide whether the time to get more support is now. As a church, you have an incredibly important part to play. But that part is not in diagnosis. It's in love. And that's something that doctors and psychologists can't do in a way that you can. And so let's partner together to help alleviate this crisis. We have a great team. As I said, I'm very, very thankful for them. They're multidisciplinary, and I think that we're onto something good. So if you know someone, if it's you as well, we would love to support you. But whether it's you or whether it's your loved one, I want to close actually probably with bad preaching method with a verse I haven't shared for these last 2 weeks. I'm going to introduce something new as I close, but it really sums up everything that I'm trying to say to you. As I sat on the floor or lay on the floor of that psychiatric hospital that day, and as those words of Desert Song came into my head, it was really this concept of identity that rang true. It's a bit of a theological buzzword, identity, but this is really what it means to me. To see what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. If you're here tonight and you're in the throes of depression or anxiety, those are real struggles, but also know that who you are is deeper than that. You're a child of a perfectly loving Heavenly Father. And if you're here and you're trying to love somebody well, consider that that person is not just a project. They're not just a frustration. Sometimes they will frustrate you, yes. But again, at their core, they are children of God, and so are you. And that spurs us on towards love and good deeds. Let me pray. Father God, I thank you for my brothers and sisters here at Waitara. Thank you that in even making space for this topic over the last 2 weeks, that they are curious and even committed to trying to work out what good mental health care looks like in our churches. And thank you so much that you have given us so many resources within our own communities to do that. That we may not be able to diagnose or to treat, but that's just one slice of a much broader response to an increasingly complex issue. Our churches can be places for when we're feeling lonely or isolated or misunderstood. We're just confused. Help us to walk side by side with one another well. Help us to play the long game, to not react too much to the highs or to the lows, but to be that stable, long-term presence, knowing that we too are recipients of a stable, long-term love, that your love for us is patient, it's slow to anger, it's abounding in love. And so when we're struggling, which we will, and when we love imperfectly, which we will, help us to keep drawing on the well and the reservoir of your love for us, to remember your mercies, to know that you are able to empathize with our weaknesses, yet you did not sin. And so because of that reality, we can find mercy and grace to help us in our time of need, whether we are struggling or whether we're trying to love one who is struggling. Thank you that those promises ring true no matter who we are in this room tonight. And so help us to be more and more characterized as people first and foremost of love. And would that be the true north that helps us navigate the rest of life, whether it's in this area of mental health or anything. You teach us that all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commands. So help us, whether we've been Christians for a year or a decade or longer, to not lose the forest from the trees, to remember that sometimes first principles are there for a reason, and that we would keep working out what love requires day by day, more and more, through the grace of Christ. Amen.
There to love people who are struggling. Some people might draw a parallel with, if they used to say water safety lessons. You see someone drowning, don't jump in, because they'll climb on top of you and push you under.
Yep.
And so I'm wondering, sometimes some people might have a hesitation when it comes to someone who's struggling, whether I want to walk beside them, this might drag me under. And so can you maybe talk a bit more about healthy boundaries?
Yeah, it's a really important conversation. And frankly, I'll give you an answer, but I'm going to confess that I'm a hypocrite here. I talked about sometimes being the needed one becomes an identity, and that's a challenge for me all of the time. The best answer I can, to start with, you do need boundaries, otherwise you will sink as well, and I've come close to sinking, trying to help others. A bit self-conscious because it's an abstract answer, but one of the things that I preach to myself often is that Jesus calls me to love my neighbour. He does not call me to save my neighbour. And so I think sometimes the reason we jump in, proverbially, is because we believe that we're the only force able to rescue. And I think that's not entirely true. Well, it's not true at all. You are part of the solution, but so are other people. So I think the more you can bring in a few people into the area of care, there's a concept called codependency, that if you do this in a one-on-one capacity, it can bring you both down. So I would say bring a few people in if you can. And then secondly, recognize that God is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And believe me when I say, and I've got some scars in my story from walking with other people, some of who are no longer here. It's really, really complicated and it's devastating. But we have to remember that we are not the Messiah. And that's terrifying on the one hand, but it's also really liberating on the other to go, God is calling me to love, but he's not calling me to ultimately control the destiny of another person. And I think ironically that leads to a longer term, more boundary giving kind of love that doesn't panic too much, there are times of acute mental health response when you've just got to drive someone to emergency, that's true. But outside of those moments, I'd say recognising that playing the long game means that sometimes you are going to have to pull back, and that's okay, because you're going to re-engage.
Does anyone have a question they might like to ask Chris? If not, that's all.
You say at a time to listen and a time to speak.
Yep.
Now's not the time to speak. Now's the time to speak.
You say there's a time to listen and a time to speak. You also say play the long game.
Yep.
What if you know it's not the time to speak, but there's nothing to listen to, and you're trying to play the long game, but...
What do you mean by there's nothing to listen to?
Like the person maybe doesn't want to speak about it, but you've noticed a change in them.
Yeah, thank you. Noticing a change in someone is not a guarantee that they will see eye to eye with your perspective. And my experience, I'll speak for myself. When I'm at my worst, frankly, I can be a bit of a jerk sometimes. And so it is a costly love to take that risk and bring something up with someone and having it pushed back in your face. I would come back to what I just said about that your job is not to save that person. And so I would say, okay, they're not ready. I've got two choices. I keep walking with them and don't bring it up for a little while. Or I just go, oh, that person's too hard, they're too toxic, they don't want to listen, I'll just walk away. And I would advocate for the first. So you ultimately can't force someone into that GP's office, and you can't force them to see what you're seeing. And if they don't want to see that, then I would just say, remain in their life and pick another moment at another time. That would be better than getting frustrated and withdrawing, which is a tempting option. And I think in our secular narrative is increasingly the wisdom that I think is very hurtful. Again, this idea of someone being a toxic person or too difficult, and we just write them off. People who are struggling with mental illness can be toxic in that secular sense, as we might use the word. But we still re-engage with the love of Christ as much as we can. It's a good question.
Any other questions? John, just one question.
You touched on briefly medication.
Yep.
And the role of medication. I listen to very different people who are very anti-medication, and I just wonder where you stand. At what is there a role for it? Is there not? Where? When?
Thank you.
Kind of thing.
Yeah. Yes, I think there's a role for it. I'll say something I'm about to say very, very cautiously as a non-psychologist, a non-psychiatrist. I think across the board as a Western society, we're probably over-medicating. I think it's, and I'll say why I think that in a moment. So I'm on medication. I've been on medication for 15 years. So I do believe in it. And yet I do think we're over-medicating sometimes. Medication, I think the best description I've had told to me is that it will bring the highs and the lows together into more of a middle ground. So when I went into hospital, they tried me on a few different medications, again, one of which I'm still on now. And it was, I think it helps just reverse the force of my spiral a little bit in a way that I couldn't cognitively do myself at that moment. And yet, here's why I think we sometimes over-medicate. It can't be the sum total of the recovery. There's a lot of hard work involved that I have to bring to the table as well. But the catch-22 is, where do I find the energy to put in that work? Sometimes that's where the medication can come in and can just start firing those pathways in a way that they just haven't. So psychologists call this neuroplasticity, the flexibility of our brain. When we go through therapy, we're engaging in neuroplastic activities, but sometimes part of that plasticity, that flexibility, has to be found with the intervention of medication. You start tapping into a bit of theology of mental illness. Is it just disbelief in God? Is it a physiological thing? Is it, have I done something wrong? And I think as Christians, we need to be asking questions from as many of those bases as possible in a way that doesn't have to choose between one or the other. Sometimes in my depressive state, I do sin, and I need to repent of that. And sometimes I'm depressed because my brain is just not functioning as it should. So in a nutshell, I do think medication has a role, even as a Christian, an important role. But I do think humility before God to recognise our shortcomings means that we can't see medication as this false messiah that it's not. I think the gospel requires us to work on our hearts as well as medication helping us in our minds.
Not sure I've ever held a microphone. I know you mentioned that it is often a long-term process. What if the person has already been to the GP, been to a psychologist, been on drugs, been on different drugs, been to another psychologist, been to another GP, and it has already been a very long-term process, but with no improvement at all? Is it simply that as they're your loved one, you still just patiently just walk beside them for a long period of time?
Yes. It's always, I think, sage to ask, is there another angle here that we can explore? I think the heartache of your question is tapping into hope for a loved one, and when we start feeling hopeless that we've tried everything and there's nothing left to try, it's devastating. Without wanting to give a trite answer, I do think the more we can explore our needs spiritually, psychologically, physically, our diet, our exercise. I think sometimes psychology has been, again, much like medication, sold as this one-stop shop of wellness. But again, I think as a Christian, heart, soul, mind and strength means let's tackle it from every avenue possible. And if we do, and we still feel like there's a lack of progress, as much as I'd love to give this breakthrough answer, I think sometimes God's love just requires us to stay present. And I know that's a deeply dissatisfying answer in many ways. It reminds us that we're not in the new creation yet, and this world is broken. And I do think we can always keep choosing to love. But again, I've got deep wounds, and I'm happy to share them with you afterwards if that would help. And I just have to keep preaching to myself that I just got to keep loving. People have died in my life from mental illness, and that is a deep pain that I will never get over on the one hand. But even in hindsight, I think back to those people, and I think I'm so glad I kept loving till the very end. I don't regret that, even though it didn't go obviously how I wanted it to go. So I guess in a nutshell, ask yourself whether there's any other angles you can pursue it from, and if there's not, I'd just say keep going and get care yourself.
Anything else to ask? Sandra.
Thank you. Do your clinic use medical insurance?
Do you mean do our practitioners have their own insurances?
No.
Or can clients use their own insurance? The short answer is it depends on the circumstance. We're happy to look at, we're 9 months old, and we're trying to say yes to as many requests as possible, but there's certain situations that we can say yes to and certain ones we can say no to. So I would say our practice manager is very helpful for this, and if you give her a call, she'll be able to help you work out whether we can or we can't. Yeah, we do our very best to say yes.
You're asking more questions this week than last week. That's excellent. Good job. We're warming up. Maybe we should book you in next week.
I'm out of material. I've got nothing left to say.
Okay. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much, Chris. Let's show
so much
Chris
for
our
having me,
appreciation and give him a round of applause. Thank you so much.